Hey everyone, this is Brian Barczyk from BHB Reptiles and Snake Bites TV. You're listening to the Herp Herpere Show.
It says here we should work in teams. I tend to think of myself as a one-man wolf pack.
You are about to enter Information Overload, a worldwide transmission with Herp Herpere's featured Breeder of the Week. Here's your host, Jason Rossi.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening in on this episode of Herp Herpere. I'm your guest host, Sean Bradley, filling in for Jason Rossi. This is going to be the second episode of 2013, and you can listen to this podcast by way of iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or RossiReptiles.com. This episode is going to be part 2 of a 3-part series that we're doing with me hosting. In this second part, I'm going to be interviewing the person that I think provided the most influence for me to grow into a professional breeder and do this as a career, and that's Brian Barczyk from BHB Enterprises. In last week's episode, I interviewed my understudy. It's Tim Bailey of Bailey & Bailey Reptiles. So if you haven't listened to that show, I really suggest you check it out because Tim's got a lot to share with newcomers that want to really climb the ladder of breeding and keeping reptiles as a semi-professional, hopefully professional hobby or business in the future. So yeah, finally for the third part of the series, I'm going to be collecting various questions from you guys, all the listeners, about the business practices, shipping methods, anything like that. I mentioned it last week on Tim's show too. So please, as you listen to this show with Brian, think of questions you'd like me to answer and email them to me. It's Sean, S-E-A-N, at exoticsbynature.com. Or you can catch up with me on Facebook. It's under my personal name. It's Sean, S-E-A-N, Bradley. And you can message me there. So anyway, without further delay, I'd like to welcome Brian Barczyk to the show. Hey, Brian, how are you?
Good, Sean. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be a part of this.
Great. It's really funny that I first met Brian and his wife Lori when I was about 14 years old at Orlando, at the Orlando show, which is now the Daytona show, and I was barely able to see over his table displays. Lori frequently jokes with me about that. His collection contains a lot of ball pythons, but he has a large number of other species. So I guess after knowing you for 20 years or so and having you influence me so much in so many areas, not just ball pythons, but colubrids and other business things, you started a collection that was pretty serious a while before I met you. So I guess my first question for you is, when did you get interested in the business of breeding reptiles on a professional scale, and how did you start that off, if you could sum it up for us?
Yeah, well, first off, it's like you said, it was, I remember well meeting you in Orlando, and you were always so enthusiastic, and I remember every year you'd come up and buy, a pair of striped corns or something like that for us. So it was always one of the, things that me and Lori look forward to, and it was awesome to kind of just now become such good friends over the years. But getting on to the business side of things, much like you were when I first met you, I was always really infatuated with reptiles. I mean, ever since I can remember, I've told the story a ton of times where literally my first memory as a human being was when my mom tells me I was 2 years old, was when we visited a local zoo and I saw, believe it or not, a ball python as an exhibit. And it's amazing that is my earliest memory as a person. And so I think I was destined to work with reptiles just because of that, if nothing else. But as my whole life, I was just, into reptiles. Unfortunately, I came from a family that was terrified of reptiles and didn't have any pets, not even a dog. So it was kind of this really miserable experience of being a diehard animal lover that drew pictures of dinosaurs and drew pictures of snakes and watched every TV program on anything back then, and not being able to actually experience it. And years and years and years, I begged my mom to get a snake and to get other animals as pets, even goldfish or anything, just something living that I could care for. And fortunately, I was probably about, right around the age that me and you met, Sean. I was probably between 13 and 14. I started frequenting a local pet shop, and literally, when I mean that, literally every day after school, I would go there and hang out for hours. And finally, I think my mom just realized, and it got to the point where I was such a staple at the shop, I would actually help out for free. They'd have me clean cages and do whatever else for free. And ultimately, I ended up working there later on when I turned 16. But finally, for my 15th birthday, my mom allowed me to get my first snake, and it was a Burmese python, believe it or not, which I still look back on that and think, what the heck, talk about not doing research, and I don't understand how the pet shop could probably have sold a Burmese python as my first pet. But regardless, it was a great animal, and ultimately I ended up getting a ball python and then a boa constrictor, and then ironically enough, just like me meeting you, I met Mark Bell. And Mark Bell used to supply from Reptile Industries or RepMart, and they used to supply the store that I ultimately worked in with their reptiles, captive bred reptiles. And at the time, I didn't know anything about breeding snakes, and I didn't even know that you could breed snakes per se. And I kind of became friends with Mark, and he was here up in Michigan with me, and he was a small time guy. Just back then he was a big guy, but he only had a couple hundred snakes. But back then, a couple hundred snakes was considered enormous.
That was a serious collection then.
Yeah, back then it really was, and so I had the opportunity to go over Mark's house on numerous occasions, and realized, like, hey, this would be really awesome to breed some snakes and maybe make a few extra dollars to help pay my way through college or whatever it is. And that's what happened is I bought a few animals from him. I bred a few things, nothing too spectacular, but it certainly could see the potential. And then that's when the really thing that changed, I think the entire future of the hobby, to be honest with you, happened, and that was when Bob Clark started producing albino Burmese pythons, and Mark was early in on that march of Burmese pythons, and he bought a group of animals, of babies from Bob Clark at a kind of wholesale price, and he was going to sell the majority of them off and keep his 2 pair, 3 pair, whatever he was going to do. And I happened to be the recipient of one of that pair of albino Burmese pythons for $3,000. And again, that was every dollar I had, from paper route to
and that was a ton of money for a snake. For a snake.
It was not only a ton of money for a snake, but it was also a ton of money for a kid that,
right.
I mean, it's unbelievable that my mom even somehow allowed me to take all of this money that I had saved up for college and spend it on a pair of snakes. What a crazy thing. But I really, have to always go back and respect my mom for allowing me to do that. And sure enough, I continued to grow the rest of my collection, although I had spent most of my money. I was still, again, doing, paper route and working at the pet shop at the time, making enough money to still buy more snakes. And I was a hustler, just like I know you were, growing up in this business too, where I would, buy 10 snow corns from Mark for, $30, and they'd retail for $50, and I would sell 8 of them off for $50 to pay for the 3 that I was keeping, or whatever the case, whatever the numbers worked out. So I was still growing my collection, but then, fortunately, when I was 17, just before I turned 18, I produced my first albino Burmese pythons and made $40,000 that year on albino Burmese pythons and hetero Burmese pythons. And that's really what started it. I thought to myself, and still I was like, I'm going to go to school, and I did. I went to college for a couple years, and by the time I was in my second year of college, I was just making way more money breeding snakes than I could doing what I wanted to do, which was either zoology or microbiology. And I thought to myself, well, this is what I love, and there was just starting to be the kind of, professional breeders, full-time breeders, guys like Eugene Bissett and a few other guys were quitting their jobs and going full-time into snake breeding. And I thought, why not me, and I thought I would give it a roll, and, here we are 25 years later.
Yeah, that's great. That's an outstanding story, and I guess in a lot of ways it bears a lot of similarity to probably a lot of us that are doing this full-time. So I guess, having said that, like you said, you move on from one to another. I mean, how I had one snake, and I had 4, and I had 20. And we had a third bedroom in the house, and my mom, like your mom, a lot of patience, and